What up, Pipeline? It is so good to see you guys again. On Sunday morning, we were talking about 2 Timothy chapter 2. And so I said that there was way too much for us to cover in just one Sunday. You know I love to just talk as long as I can about the verses. So instead of keeping us in Pipeline for like an hour, we said we'd talk about them over the week in some social media. So here's what we're doing. Whether you're on Instagram or YouTube, we're going to cover verses 11 through 13 today, just a couple minutes, and then you can look forward to the rest of them later. And so we're going to keep the verses right here for you so you can read along as we unpack these verses. I got them on my screen right below the camera. It says, "This is a trustworthy saying. If we die with him, we will also live with him. If we endure hardship, we will reign with him. If we deny him, he will deny us. If we are unfaithful, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny who he is." And so the he there is Jesus. Paul is writing about Jesus to Timothy. We've talked about this for the past couple Sundays. You should be there. And so Paul's writing to Timothy. Paul's writing from prison to Timothy. And so Paul is speaking from experience when he talks about what it means to endure hardship and to suffer for Christ and what that really looks like. And so as we look at these verses, we can Paul isn't using like metaphors. Paul is speaking literally. And so he starts by saying that this is a trustworthy saying, or it's an expression that you can trust, because there are a lot of things you hear around church or from Christians that sound like good, but you don't know if you can believe them. So he's saying this is something that you can believe. And then he says what it is. And so he says, if we die with Jesus, which Paul also talks about what it like to die with God is gain. Philippians 1:21, to live as Christ, to die is gain. To die with Jesus means that you're going to live with Jesus as well. Then he says, if we endure hardship, we will reign with Jesus, right? To die with Jesus is to be faithful, as long as you live, to be faithful, and to die proclaiming Jesus. And if you do that, you're going to live with Jesus. If you truly believe that Jesus is your Lord, that's what that means. And then the next verse says, if we endure hardship for Jesus, then you will reign with him, like living with Jesus, reigning with Jesus. So Paul is speaking like right now he is enduring hardship for Jesus as he writes it. And so it's a big promise that, man, if you suffer for the sake of Jesus, you're going to reign with Jesus someday. But then the next part is something that's often misquoted. Like it's just left on its own. It's like, oh, that's fine. And it says, if you deny Jesus, he will deny you. And you see that on social media. You're like scrolling through Facebook or Instagram and someone's like, oh, repost this because if you deny Jesus, he's going to deny you and you don't want that. That's not exactly what it means. It's saying if we deny him, like the verse is right above. If it says, if you don't think living with Jesus is worth dying for Jesus, if you don't think reigning with Jesus is worth enduring hardship for Jesus, if you're denying those truths, then you're denying Jesus and he will deny you. If you don't believe that Jesus is worth giving your life for, if you don't believe suffering is worth Jesus, reigning with Jesus, that's denying Jesus. And Paul and the other apostles, we talked about it on Sunday in the book of Acts, a lot of them, they viewed suffering even to the point of death as something like, man, that sounds awesome if they view me as important enough to suffer for Jesus. Like they're beating me up for the sake of the gospel. That's cool because they think I'm worth it. So the disciples thought it was an honor and a privilege to endure hardship for Jesus. But Paul's saying to Timothy and everybody reading it, if you don't think suffering for Jesus is worth what it is, like if you don't think reigning with Jesus is worth going through suffering for Jesus, then you're denying Jesus. You don't really believe he is who he says he is. And then this is another expression that maybe gets twisted out of context. It says, if we are unfaithful, or if we have no faith, if you're faithless, he remains faithful. And often you might hear that as like a reassuring thing, like, man, if you don't have faith, God's still faithful. And when we do that, we try to make the Bible about us. And it's not about us, it's about God. And this whole passage is about God's glory and God's name. And when we listen to, or when we look at it expecting God's glory, it changes the focus. It shifts the focus off of us and onto God. So if we are unfaithful, meaning if we don't live up to those couple verses above, if we don't die for him, if we don't endure hardship for him, if we're unfaithful to those, God is still faithful to deny us because we're denying him. You know what I mean? So if you look at those verses, if God is still faithful regardless of whether we're faithful, which is good and bad. It's bad because God is faithful to his word, saying if we deny him, he's going to deny us. But God is also faithful that if we die for him, if we endure hardship for him, we get to live with him and reign with him. And it says he cannot deny who he is. God can't change his character. God is the way that he is, God is going to be faithful no matter what we do. So that's something that, man, if you think it's all about you, that can sound like bad news. But when you have your perspective on God first and focused on God's goodness, God's glory, God's gospel and name, it changes everything. And now it's like, man, I get to see that God is worth it. And so I should live for God, and I should die for God. I should endure hardship for Jesus and for his gospel, because that means that I'll get to live and reign with him someday forever. And so Paul's writing this. Remember, the whole book is about fulfilling your ministry. So Paul's writing this to encourage Timothy, fulfill your ministry, live in a way that reflects your ministry and honors your ministry. And so as we read that, that's why Paul wrote it, was to encourage Timothy to stay faithful, to stay loyal, and to fulfill the ministry he had ahead of him. So for you guys, man, don't be discouraged when you read that. You should have hope and joy that God is faithful and those promises will be true. So live in a way that reflects it. All right, we'll go over some of the other verses later this week. See you guys.